January 17, 1991. The night sky over Tel Aviv erupts with air raid sirens. Israeli families scramble into sealed rooms, frantically pulling on gas masks, sealing doors with tape and wet towels. Children are crying. Parents are trying to stay calm while their hands shake as they check their masks, double-check the room seals, and listen to the radio for instructions. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a missile is coming. A Scud missile launched from western Iraq, flying hundreds of miles across Jordan and the desert, arcing through the sky toward Israel's most populated city. This is not supposed to be happening. Israel is not even part of the war. Iraq invaded Kuwait. An international coalition led by the United States is fighting to liberate Kuwait. Israel has nothing to do with this conflict. But Saddam Hussein has decided to drag Israel into the fight, to fire missiles at Israeli cities, to kill Israeli civilians, to provoke Israel into retaliating. And his strategy is working. The Israeli government is furious. The Israeli military is ready to strike back. Israeli fighter jets are being armed and fueled for retaliatory strikes on Iraq. The Israeli cabinet is meeting in emergency session to authorize military action. Within hours, Israel could be at war with Iraq. And if that happens, the entire coalition against Saddam could collapse. Arab nations that are fighting alongside the United States cannot be seen as allies of Israel. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, all would face intense domestic pressure to leave the coalition if Israel joins the fight. The war that America is winning could fall apart because of a few primitive missiles that barely work. This is the story of the Scud attacks on Israel, of how Iraq tried to shatter the coalition by turning the Gulf War into an Arab-Israeli conflict, and of how the United States desperately worked to keep Israel out of the war, even as Iraqi missiles rained down on Israeli cities. To understand why Saddam Hussein attacked Israel, you need to understand the impossible position he found himself in by January 1991. 5 months earlier, in August 1990, Iraq had invaded and occupied Kuwait. Saddam had expected the world to accept this as a fait accompli, a done deal that everyone would grumble about but ultimately tolerate. He was catastrophically wrong. The international community, led by the United States, assembled a massive coalition to force Iraq out of Kuwait. By January, more than 500,000 coalition troops were in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. Saddam was facing the prospect of a war he could not win. The coalition air campaign had begun on January 17, and Iraqi forces were being systematically destroyed from the air. Iraqi air defenses were being taken apart. Iraqi command and control was being shattered. Iraqi military installations were being bombed into rubble. Saddam needed a strategy to survive, and he settled on one that was both clever and desperate. He would try to split the coalition by turning the war into a conflict between Arabs and Israelis. The logic was straightforward, even if the execution was brutal. If Saddam could provoke Israel into attacking Iraq, then the Arab members of the coalition would face an impossible political situation. How could Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Syria fight alongside Israel against another Arab nation? The domestic political pressure in these countries would be enormous. There were already significant populations in these nations who sympathized with Iraq, who saw Saddam as standing up to Western imperialism, who opposed their government's alliance with the United States. If Israel entered the war, these sympathies would explode into open opposition. Governments might fall. At minimum, Arab nations would have to leave the coalition. The alliance that threatened Saddam's regime would fracture. This was his plan: attack Israel. Make the attacks deadly enough and humiliating enough that Israel would have to retaliate. Then watch the coalition collapse. The weapon Saddam chose for this strategy was the Scud missile. The Scud is a Soviet-designed tactical ballistic missile that has been around since the 1950s. It is not a particularly sophisticated weapon. It is essentially a large rocket with a warhead attached. You point it in the general direction of your target, launch it, and hope it lands somewhere in the right area. The Scud is notoriously inaccurate. Even at shorter ranges, its circular error probable, meaning the radius within which half of the missiles will land, is measured in hundreds of meters. At longer ranges, the inaccuracy gets worse. This means that the Scud cannot hit specific military targets with any reliability. It cannot destroy a particular building or take out a specific installation. But it can hit cities. Cities are big. If you aim a Scud at Tel Aviv, it will probably land somewhere in or near Tel Aviv. You cannot choose which neighborhood, which street, which building, but you will hit the city. This makes the Scud a terror weapon, not a military weapon. Its value is not in destroying military targets, but in creating fear, panic, and political pressure. Iraq had acquired Scud missiles from the Soviet Union in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq had used Scuds against Iranian cities during that conflict, launching hundreds of missiles in what became known as the War of the Cities. Both sides fired ballistic missiles at each other's urban centers, killing civilians and causing panic. Iraq had also developed modified versions of the Scud with extended range. The original Soviet Scud-B had a range of about 300 kilometers. Iraqi engineers modified the missiles, reducing the warhead size and increasing the fuel capacity to extend the range to 600 kilometers or more. These modified missiles were called Al-Hussein and Al-Abaz by the Iraqis. The modifications made the missiles even less accurate and less reliable, but they gave Iraq the ability to reach targets deeper into Iran and, importantly, to reach Israel from launch sites in western Iraq. By the start of the Gulf War, Iraq had dozens of mobile Scud launchers scattered across the country, particularly in western Iraq. These launchers were mounted on large trucks, making them mobile and difficult to find. A Scud launcher could drive to a prepared firing position, set up, launch its missile, and then drive away within an hour. This mobility made them very hard to destroy. Coalition aircraft could patrol the skies looking for launchers, but the Iraqi crews became adept at hiding during the day and moving only at night. They used camouflage, decoys, and clever tactics to avoid detection. The hunt for these launchers would become one of the major efforts of the air campaign, consuming thousands of sorties and enormous resources. The first Scud attacks on Israel came on January 17, 1991, the same day the coalition air campaign began. 7 missiles were fired at Israeli cities that night. Some hit Tel Aviv, Israel's largest city and commercial center. Some hit Haifa, Israel's major northern port city. The missiles caused significant damage to buildings, but remarkably, there were only minor injuries. This would be a pattern throughout the Scud campaign. The missiles were terrifying and destructive, but not particularly deadly. The warheads were not large enough or accurate enough to cause mass casualties, and the Israeli civil defense measures, particularly the sealed rooms and gas masks, protected people from the worst effects. But the terror was real. Israeli civilians had never experienced anything like this. Israel had fought multiple wars, but those wars were fought on the borders or in occupied territories. Israeli cities had not been subjected to missile attacks. There had been suicide bombings and terrorist attacks, but those were targeted, localized incidents. A ballistic missile attack was different. There was no warning beyond the air raid siren. There was no way to intercept the missile, at least not initially. There was no way to know where it would land. You could only seal yourself in a room, put on your gas mask, and wait. The fear was compounded by uncertainty about the warheads. Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons. He had used them against Iranian soldiers during the Iran-Iraq War. He had used them against Kurdish civilians in Iraq, most notoriously in the 1988 Halabja attack that killed thousands. Would he use chemical weapons against Israel? No one knew. The Israeli government had to assume he might, hence the gas masks and sealed rooms. The sealed room concept was based on civil defense doctrine developed during the Cold War and adapted for chemical warfare. Each household was instructed to choose one room, usually an interior room without windows or with windows that could be sealed. The room would be prepared with plastic sheeting and tape to seal all cracks and openings. When the air raid sirens sounded, the family would go to the sealed room, close the door, seal it with tape and wet towels, and put on their gas masks. In theory, this would protect them from chemical agents if a Scud carried a chemical warhead. In practice, the sealing was never perfect and probably would not have provided complete protection against a direct hit with chemical weapons. But it was better than nothing, and it gave people something to do, a way to feel like they had some control over an uncontrollable situation. The psychological impact of the Scud attacks was immense. Israeli society, which prides itself on security and military strength, was suddenly vulnerable. The mighty Israeli Defense Forces, which had won multiple wars against Arab coalitions, could not stop missiles from hitting Israeli cities. The sense of helplessness was profound. This was compounded by the fact that Israel was not even a participant in the war. Israelis were being attacked for something they had not done, by an enemy they were not fighting. The natural response was to demand retaliation. Israeli public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of striking back at Iraq. Politicians, military leaders, and ordinary citizens all called for Israel to hit back, to show Saddam that attacking Israel had consequences. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, was under enormous pressure to respond. Shamir was a hawk, a former leader of the Lehi underground organization during the British Mandate period, a man who believed in striking back at enemies. He was not inclined to show restraint. The Israeli military was ready and eager to strike. The Israeli Air Force began preparing for retaliatory strikes within hours of the first Scud attacks. Israeli F-15 and F-16 fighter jets were armed with bombs and missiles. Flight plans were drawn up for strikes on Scud launchers, Iraqi military bases, and other targets in western Iraq. Israeli special forces were prepared to deploy into Iraq to hunt for Scud launchers on the ground. Everything was ready. The Israeli cabinet met to authorize the strikes. But the United States intervened. President George H.W. Bush personally called Prime Minister Shamir to urge restraint. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and Secretary of State James Baker communicated the same message through diplomatic channels. The message was blunt. Israeli retaliation would destroy the coalition. Arab nations would not fight alongside Israel against Iraq. The coalition would fracture. The war effort would be jeopardized. The United States asked Israel to do something incredibly difficult, to absorb the attacks and not retaliate. In exchange, the United States promised to make destroying the Scud launchers a top priority, to deploy Patriot missile defense batteries to Israel, and to provide real-time intelligence to help protect Israeli cities. This put Shamir in an impossible position. His political instincts, his personal history, everything told him to strike back, but he also understood the strategic reality. Israel depended on its relationship with the United States. Defying the United States during an active war when the stakes were so high would have long-term consequences for Israeli security. The United States was asking for Israeli restraint as a strategic favor. If Israel refused, it would damage the relationship at a critical moment. Shamir decided to wait, to hold off on retaliation while the United States tried to deal with the Scud problem. But he made it clear that Israel's patience was not infinite. If the attacks continued and caused mass casualties, Israel would respond regardless of American wishes. The decision to restrain Israel was controversial within the Israeli government and military. Defense Minister Moshe Aarons favored immediate retaliation. Chief of Staff Dan Shomron and many senior military officers wanted to strike. They argued that Israeli deterrence was being eroded, that every day Israel did not respond emboldened enemies and made Israel look weak. They argued that Israel had never before allowed attacks on its cities to go unanswered. They argued that this set a dangerous precedent, but Shamir, while hawkish, was also pragmatic. He understood that the United States was fighting a war that served Israeli interests. The destruction of Iraqi military power benefited Israel. If restraint helped ensure the coalition's success and the complete defeat of Iraq, then restraint was the correct choice, however painful. The United States, having asked Israel to show restraint, now had to deliver on its promises. The most visible and immediate response was the deployment of Patriot missile batteries to Israel. The Patriot was an American-made air defense system originally designed to shoot down aircraft. It had been upgraded with the capability to intercept tactical ballistic missiles, though this capability had never been tested in combat. The Patriot system used large missiles that launched from a truck-mounted launcher. The system's radar detected incoming missiles, calculated their trajectory, and fired Patriot interceptor missiles to destroy them. In theory, the Patriot could shoot down a Scud before it reached its target, protecting the city below. Within days of the first Scud attacks, Patriot batteries were being deployed to Israel. American soldiers operated the systems. This was itself unprecedented. American military forces deployed on Israeli soil to defend Israeli cities. The Patriots were positioned near Tel Aviv and Haifa, the primary targets of Iraqi Scud attacks. When Scuds were detected incoming, the Patriot radars locked on and fired interceptor missiles. The results were mixed. In some cases, the Patriots appeared to intercept the Scuds, detonating them in the air. In other cases, the Scuds were not intercepted and hit the ground. There was considerable debate, then and later, about how effective the Patriots actually were. The problem with assessing Patriot effectiveness was that even when a Patriot intercepted a Scud, the debris from both missiles would often hit the ground, causing damage. From the ground, it was hard to tell whether a particular explosion was from an intercepted Scud or from a Scud that had not been intercepted. The U.S. military initially claimed very high intercept rates, saying that Patriots destroyed 80 or 90% of the Scuds they engaged. Later analysis suggested the actual rate was much lower, perhaps 10 or 20%, and possibly even lower. Some analysts argued that the Patriots might have been completely ineffective, that they never successfully intercepted a single Scud warhead, and that all the explosions attributed to interceptions were actually the Scuds breaking up on re-entry or the Patriots detonating harmlessly. This debate continues to this day. But the effectiveness of the Patriots in a technical sense was almost beside the point. What mattered was the psychological and political impact. Israelis saw Patriot missiles launching to defend them. They saw explosions in the sky. Whether those explosions represented successful interceptions or not, the presence of the Patriots made people feel safer. It demonstrated that the United States was taking the threat seriously and was doing something to help. And from a political standpoint, it gave Shamir something to point to when critics demanded to know why Israel was not retaliating. He could say that the United States had deployed defensive systems and was working to protect Israel. The Patriots, whatever their actual effectiveness, bought time for the diplomatic strategy of restraint to work. The other major American effort was the Great Scud Hunt, the campaign to find and destroy Iraqi mobile Scud launchers. This became one of the highest priority missions of the air campaign. Hundreds of coalition aircraft were diverted from other missions to hunt for Scuds. Special forces teams were inserted into western Iraq to watch roads and report launcher locations. Satellites and reconnaissance aircraft searched for the launchers around the clock. When a launcher was spotted or its location was suspected, aircraft would attack. F-15E Strike Eagles, F-16s, A-10 Warthogs, British Tornado GR-1s, and other aircraft flew thousands of sorties in the Scud hunt. But finding and destroying mobile Scud launchers proved incredibly difficult. The launchers looked like large trucks, which is what they were. In the featureless desert of western Iraq, there were lots of trucks. Distinguishing between a Scud launcher and a fuel truck or a cargo truck from the air was challenging. The Iraqis used decoys, building fake Scud launchers out of wood and metal that looked like the real thing from the air. Pilots would attack these decoys thinking they were destroying launchers. The Iraqis also became very good at hiding. They moved only at night. They used covered positions during the day. They dispersed their launchers so they were not grouped together. They used every camouflage technique they knew. The result was that despite the enormous effort, relatively few Scud launchers were actually destroyed. The exact number is unknown and disputed. The U.S. military claimed to have destroyed dozens of launchers during the war. Post-war analysis by the United Nations and by researchers suggested that no mobile launchers were confirmed destroyed by air attack. The fixed launch sites were destroyed, but the mobile launchers survived. The Scud attacks continued throughout the war. Iraq launched a total of 42 Scud missiles at Israel during the 6 weeks of the war. The attacks were sporadic, not constant, but the threat was ever present. Israelis never knew when the next attack would come. The air raid sirens would sound, sometimes multiple times a day, and people would scramble to their sealed rooms. The casualties from the Scud attacks were remarkably low considering the number of missiles fired. 2 Israelis were killed directly by Scud impacts, one in Ramat Gan, a suburb of Tel Aviv, and another in Tel Aviv itself. Several more died from indirect causes, including heart attacks during attacks and suffocation from improper use of gas masks. Hundreds were injured, mostly from flying glass and debris. The property damage was significant. Entire apartment buildings were destroyed. Thousands of homes and businesses were damaged. But the lack of mass casualties is why Israel ultimately did not retaliate. If a single Scud had hit a building, killing dozens or hundreds of people, Israeli restraint would have ended immediately. The Israeli military would have struck regardless of American requests. But the relatively low casualty toll, combined with intense American diplomatic pressure and the visible efforts to stop the attacks, allowed Shamir to maintain restraint. This restraint came at a political cost. Shamir faced harsh criticism from opposition politicians and from some in his own coalition. The argument was that Israel was abandoning its doctrine of deterrence, that enemies were learning they could attack Israel with impunity. Some argued that Shamir was putting Israel's relationship with the United States above Israeli security and sovereignty. These criticisms were not without merit. Israel's entire defense strategy was based on deterrence, on making enemies understand that attacking Israel would result in overwhelming retaliation. By not retaliating against Iraq, Israel was sending a different message. But Shamir calculated that the long-term benefit of maintaining the coalition and ensuring Iraq's defeat outweighed the short-term cost to deterrence. It was a difficult decision with no perfect answer. The strategic impact of Israel's restraint was exactly what the United States hoped for. The coalition held together. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and other Arab nations continued to participate in the war against Iraq. There were grumblings and domestic political pressures, but no government withdrew from the coalition because of the Scud attacks on Israel. Saddam's strategy failed. He had tried to turn the Gulf War into an Arab-Israeli conflict and failed. The coalition's unity was maintained, and the war effort proceeded without disruption. This was a significant victory for American diplomacy and for Israeli strategic patience. But the restraint had limits. If Iraq had escalated, if the casualties had been higher, if chemical weapons had been used, the calculation would have changed instantly. Israeli Air Force planes were on alert throughout the war, ready to launch retaliatory strikes on short notice. Israeli Special Forces teams were prepared to deploy. The Israeli military never stood down. They simply waited. And as each day passed without a catastrophic attack, the likelihood of Israeli retaliation decreased. By the time the ground war started in late February, it was clear that the war would be over quickly. Iraq was being decisively defeated. Israeli retaliation became less necessary because the threat was being eliminated by the coalition's success. The experience of Israeli civilians during the Scud attacks was one of constant anxiety and periodic terror. The air raid sirens could sound at any time, day or night. When they did, you had to stop whatever you were doing and get to your sealed room. If you were at work, you had to use the building's sealed room or find shelter. If you were driving, you were supposed to pull over and put on your gas mask. Schools conducted drills teaching children how to put on gas masks and get to sealed rooms. The disruption to normal life was considerable. Some people stopped going out unnecessarily. Some businesses closed temporarily. The psychological toll was particularly hard on children who did not fully understand what was happening but could sense their parents' fear. There were moments of black humor that Israelis used to cope with the stress. Jokes circulated about the Scuds, about the Patriots, about Saddam. Israelis nicknamed the sealed rooms Scud rooms, a play on words in Hebrew. There was a gallows humor quality to these jokes, a way of dealing with anxiety through laughter. But underneath the humor was real fear. Every siren could be the attack that killed you. Every sealed room session could be the time a chemical warhead detonated nearby. The uncertainty was corrosive. At least in a conventional war, you know where the front lines are, where the danger is. With ballistic missiles, the danger could strike anywhere at any time. There was no front line. Everywhere was potentially the battlefield. The international reaction to the Scud attacks on Israel was complex. There was sympathy for Israel, a non-belligerent being attacked by a nation it was not at war with. But there was also relief when Israel showed restraint. European governments, particularly those contributing to the coalition, publicly supported Israel but privately urged restraint, echoing the American message. The Soviet Union, which was attempting to maintain some influence in the Middle East, tried to position itself as a potential mediator but had limited leverage. The Arab world's reaction was divided. Governments that were part of the coalition condemned the attacks, though often without great enthusiasm. Popular opinion in many Arab countries, however, was different. Saddam was seen by many as standing up to Israel and the West. There were protests in support of Saddam in Jordan, in the Palestinian territories, and in other Arab countries. This popular support did not translate into meaningful political or military assistance for Iraq, but it demonstrated the complexity of Arab public opinion. The Palestinian reaction was particularly controversial. Many Palestinians openly supported Saddam and cheered the Scud attacks on Israel. This was understandable from a Palestinian perspective. Israel was the occupying power in the West Bank and Gaza. An enemy of Israel was, from this viewpoint, a friend. PLO leader Yasser Arafat supported Saddam Hussein, a decision that would have significant negative consequences for the Palestinian cause in the years to come. The images of Palestinians celebrating as Scuds hit Tel Aviv were broadcast internationally and damaged Palestinian standing in Western public opinion. It also gave Israel justification for harsh security measures and for resisting concessions in future peace negotiations. The Palestinian support for Saddam would be remembered long after the Gulf War ended. The Jordanian position was delicate. Jordan shared a long border with Iraq and was economically dependent on Iraq. King Hussein of Jordan tried to maintain neutrality, but in practice, Jordan tilted toward Iraq. This strained Jordan's relationship with the United States and other coalition members. It also meant that Jordan allowed Iraqi trucks, possibly including some Scud launchers, to use Jordanian roads. There were reports, never fully confirmed, that some Scuds fired at Israel were launched from Jordanian territory or from areas very close to the Jordanian border. Jordan officially denied this, but the suspicion remained. After the war, Jordan worked to repair its relationships with the West and with Gulf states, but the damage from its perceived support for Saddam took years to overcome. The most deadly single Scud attack of the war did not hit Israel. It hit an American military barracks in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, on February 25, 1991. The Scud struck a warehouse being used as barracks for soldiers from the U.S. Army Reserve's 14th Quartermaster Detachment. 28 American soldiers were killed and nearly 100 were injured. This was the highest number of casualties from a single incident for coalition forces during the war. The barracks had been identified as vulnerable, but it had not been evacuated before the attack. The Patriot batteries in the area failed to intercept the incoming Scud, a failure later attributed to a software glitch in the Patriot system that caused the radar to lose track of the missile. This attack demonstrated that the Scud threat was real and deadly, not just a psychological weapon, but a genuine military threat. The technology of missile defense was primitive by today's standards in 1991. The Patriot was a first-generation theater missile defense system. It worked by detecting an incoming missile with radar, calculating its trajectory, and then launching interceptor missiles that would explode near the target, destroying it with shrapnel. The system worked well against aircraft, which are large and slow compared to ballistic missiles. But ballistic missiles re-enter the atmosphere at very high speeds, often breaking up as they do. The Scud missiles, especially the Iraqi modified versions, were particularly unstable and tended to break apart during re-entry. This made them difficult targets. The Patriot radar might track a Scud warhead, but then the missile would break apart into multiple pieces, and the radar would lose track of which piece was the warhead. The Patriot might intercept a piece of debris, while the actual warhead continued on to hit the target. The debate over Patriot effectiveness had significant implications for missile defense programs. The initial claims of high success rates were used to justify continued investment in missile defense. If the Patriots had worked as well as claimed, then missile defense was proven viable and worth expanding. But when later analysis cast doubt on these success rates, critics argued that missile defense was being oversold, that the technology was not reliable, and that the money would be better spent on other defense priorities. This debate, which began with the Patriots in the Gulf War, has continued for 3 decades with successive generations of missile defense systems. For Israel, the lesson was clear. Ballistic missiles were a real threat that would not go away. After the Gulf War, Israel invested heavily in its own missile defense capabilities. This eventually led to the development of the Arrow missile defense system, designed specifically to intercept ballistic missiles. Israel also developed the Iron Dome system to intercept short-range rockets and missiles, a system that has proven highly effective in protecting Israeli cities from rocket attacks from Gaza and Lebanon. The Scud attacks of 1991 were the catalyst for these programs. They demonstrated that Israel could not rely entirely on deterrence, that defensive capabilities were also necessary. The diplomatic aftermath of the Scud crisis had several components. The United States owed Israel a debt for its restraint, and this debt was paid in various ways. American military aid to Israel increased. Intelligence cooperation deepened. The United States supported Israeli positions in various international forums. There was also a sense that the United States had demonstrated its commitment to Israeli security in a tangible way, deploying American forces to defend Israeli cities. This strengthened the U.S.-Israel relationship, which had sometimes been tense during the 1980s over issues like Israeli settlements in the occupied territories and Israel's invasion of Lebanon. But there was also a cost to Israel's restraint. The perception in the Arab world and beyond was that Israel had been constrained by the United States, that Israel had followed American orders. This did not enhance Israel's image as an independent power. Some Arab commentators suggested that this showed Israel was a client state of the United States, not a sovereign nation making its own decisions. This narrative was uncomfortable for Israel, which prides itself on independence and self-reliance. Israeli leaders pushed back against this characterization, arguing that restraint was an Israeli decision made in Israeli interests, not an American demand that Israel reluctantly accepted. But the perception persisted. The impact on Saddam Hussein's standing was also mixed. He had failed in his strategic objective of splitting the coalition. He had lost the war decisively. His military was destroyed. His economy was devastated. But in the eyes of some in the Arab world, he had stood up to the West and survived. He had attacked Israel and gotten away with it. This gave him a certain prestige that he exploited in the years after the Gulf War. Even though Iraq remained under international sanctions and was economically crippled, Saddam portrayed himself as the Arab leader who had defied America and Israel and lived to tell the tale. This narrative ignored the reality that Iraq had been crushed militarily and that the survival of Saddam's regime was due to the coalition's decision not to march on Baghdad, not to any Iraqi military success. But narratives often matter more than facts in shaping public opinion. The technological arms race in the Middle East accelerated after the Gulf War. If Iraq could fire ballistic missiles at Israel, then other countries would want the same capability. Iran, Syria, and other nations accelerated their own ballistic missile programs. Israel, as mentioned, invested in missile defense. The proliferation of ballistic missiles in the Middle East became a major security concern. These missiles were not accurate enough to be effective against military targets, but they were perfectly suited for terrorizing cities. The risk was that future conflicts would see missiles flying between capitals, killing civilians and escalating tensions. This risk has partially materialized in subsequent conflicts, with Iranian missiles targeting Saudi Arabia, with Hezbollah firing rockets at Israel, with the constant threat of ballistic missile attacks shaping regional security dynamics. The question of chemical weapons and why Saddam did not use them against Israel remains debated. Saddam had chemical weapons. He had used them before. The expectation at the start of the Gulf War was that he might use them again, particularly if he felt cornered. The Israelis certainly expected chemical attacks, hence the gas masks and sealed rooms, but no chemical warheads were used on the Scuds fired at Israel or Saudi Arabia. Why not? Several theories have been proposed. One is that Saddam feared overwhelming retaliation. The United States had quietly communicated that chemical weapons use would result in a devastating response, possibly including the use of American tactical nuclear weapons, though this was never explicitly stated. Saddam may have calculated that using chemical weapons would guarantee his regime's destruction. Another theory is that Saddam wanted to keep the coalition together, or at least wanted to avoid giving the coalition a justification for expanding war aims to include regime change. Using chemical weapons would have eliminated any lingering international sympathy for Iraq and would have justified more aggressive coalition actions. A third theory is more prosaic. Perhaps Saddam simply did not have chemical warheads for his Scud missiles in working condition. Fitting a chemical warhead onto a ballistic missile is technically challenging. The warhead has to survive the acceleration of launch, the heat of re-entry, and then disperse the chemical agent effectively upon impact. Iraq may not have successfully developed reliable chemical warheads for the Scud. There is evidence that Iraq experimented with chemical warheads, but the tests were not entirely successful. If Saddam did not have confidence that the chemical warheads would work, he may have decided not to use them for fear of demonstrating weakness. Firing a chemical weapon that fails to function would be worse than not firing one at all. Whatever the reason, the absence of chemical attacks was a relief to everyone involved and reduced the pressure on Israel to retaliate. The lessons learned from the Scud campaign influenced military doctrine and technology development in multiple countries. The vulnerability of cities to ballistic missile attack became a recognized problem. The difficulty of finding and destroying mobile missile launchers became a recognized challenge. The partial effectiveness of missile defense became a recognized limitation. These lessons were studied and incorporated into military planning. The U.S. military developed better sensors for detecting launches, better intelligence fusion systems for tracking mobile targets, and better weapons for attacking time-sensitive targets like mobile launchers. But many of the fundamental problems remained unsolved. Finding and destroying mobile missile launchers in a large area is still one of the hardest challenges in modern warfare. The psychological resilience of Israeli society during the Scud attacks is worth noting. Despite the fear and disruption, Israeli society did not panic. People went to work, schools stayed open, the economy continued to function. There was anxiety, but not collapse. This resilience was partly due to Israeli experience with war and terrorism, which had built a certain toughness into the society. It was also due to confidence in the Israeli military and in the protective measures like the sealed rooms. And it was due to a sense of national unity in the face of external threat, a common pattern in Israeli history. When attacked, Israelis tend to unify and endure. This resilience was tested again in later conflicts, including the Second Lebanon War in 2006, when Hezbollah fired rockets at northern Israel, and during various rounds of conflict with Gaza, when rockets were fired at southern and central Israel. Each time, Israeli society demonstrated the same basic resilience, adapting to the threat and continuing to function despite it. The question of whether Israel's restraint in 1991 set a precedent has been debated. Some argue that it showed enemies that Israel could be attacked without immediate retaliation, that political calculations could override the doctrine of immediate response. Others argue that the Gulf War was a unique situation, that the coalition context created special circumstances that would not apply in other conflicts. In practice, Israeli behavior in subsequent conflicts has been mixed. Israel has sometimes shown restraint when attacked, calculating that restraint serves its interests. Israel has sometimes responded with overwhelming force, sending the message that attacks will be punished. The decision seems to depend on the specific circumstances rather than on a fixed doctrine. The 1991 restraint was an exception, not a new rule. The human cost of the Scud attacks, while relatively low in terms of deaths, was significant in terms of trauma and disruption. Thousands of Israelis suffered from anxiety disorders, depression, and other psychological effects from the attacks. The constant stress of not knowing when the next attack would come took a toll. Some people developed symptoms of PTSD even though they were not directly hit. The sound of air raid sirens, which continued to be used in Israel for warnings about rocket attacks, became a trigger for people who had experienced the Scud attacks. For many Israelis, the memory of sitting in a sealed room with a gas mask on, listening to explosions, and not knowing if their family was safe, remained a vivid and traumatic memory for the rest of their lives. The economic impact on Israel was substantial but temporary. Tourism collapsed during the war. Some businesses shut down. There was property damage that had to be repaired. But the Israeli economy was resilient and recovered quickly after the war ended. The United States provided financial assistance to help offset the economic costs, recognizing that Israeli restraint had been valuable to American strategic interests. In the longer term, the war demonstrated to Israel the importance of economic diversification and resilience, lessons that influenced economic policy in the 1990s. The impact on American military planning was significant. The Gulf War had demonstrated that even a decisively successful military campaign could face strategic complications from unexpected quarters. The Scud problem, which seemed minor compared to the main military objectives, consumed enormous resources and created serious political risks. This taught planners that secondary threats can have strategic importance, that unconventional responses by an enemy can complicate even the most well-planned campaign. Future military planning would try to anticipate and address these kinds of asymmetric threats before they became crises. The coalition's success in keeping Israel out of the war, despite the Scud attacks, was ultimately a triumph of diplomacy backed by military action. The diplomatic efforts to convince Israel to show restraint, the deployment of Patriots to provide at least symbolic defense, the massive diversion of air power to hunt Scuds, all of these combined to achieve the strategic objective of maintaining the coalition. This required intense, sustained effort at the highest levels of the U.S. government. President Bush was personally involved, making multiple calls to Prime Minister Shamir. Secretary of State Baker spent significant time on the Israel issue. The military commanders in theater had to divert resources from other priorities. The effort was worthwhile because it prevented the coalition from fracturing, but it also revealed how fragile the coalition was, how a relatively minor military threat had the potential to derail the entire war effort if not carefully managed. The role of the media in covering the Scud attacks was significant. For the first time, there was real-time television coverage of missile attacks. CNN and other networks broadcast live from Tel Aviv and Haifa as the Scuds hit. Correspondents wore gas masks on camera. Buildings exploded in the background. This created powerful images that shaped public opinion. It also created pressure on political leaders to respond. When people around the world were watching Israeli cities being attacked in real time, the pressure on Israel to retaliate and the pressure on the United States to stop the attacks became more intense. The 24-hour news cycle and the technology of live broadcasting added new dimensions to the crisis that had not existed in previous wars. The accuracy, or lack thereof, of media reporting during the Scud attacks was sometimes problematic. Initial reports often overestimated casualties or damage. The fog of war combined with the pressure to report immediately led to errors. Some early reports suggested that chemical weapons had been used when they had not. Other reports claimed successful Patriot intercepts that may not have actually occurred. Over time, more accurate information emerged, but the initial reports shaped perceptions. This pattern of rapid, but sometimes inaccurate reporting, followed by later corrections, has become standard in modern media coverage of conflicts. But it was relatively new in 1991 and created challenges for decision-makers who had to sort fact from speculation. The long-term consequences of the Scud crisis extended well beyond the end of the Gulf War. The precedent of Israel showing restraint under American pressure would be referenced in future crises. The development of missile defense systems in Israel and elsewhere was a direct consequence. The recognition that ballistic missiles were a significant threat in the Middle East-shaped regional security policies. The lessons about the difficulty of countering mobile missile launchers influenced military doctrine. The experience of managing a coalition that included both Arab states and indirect Israeli involvement shaped future approaches to coalition warfare in the Middle East. All of these consequences flowed from those tense 6 weeks in early 1991, when Scud missiles fell on Israeli cities, and the world watched to see if Israel would enter the war. In the end, Israel's restraint was a strategic victory, even though it felt like a humiliation to many Israelis at the time. The alternative, Israeli retaliation leading to coalition collapse and a longer, more complicated war, would have been worse for everyone. The defeat of Iraq was swift and decisive because the coalition held together. Iraq's military was destroyed. Saddam's aggressive expansionism was stopped. Kuwait was liberated. All of this was achieved with relatively low coalition casualties because the war was fought with overwhelming force and without the complications that Israeli involvement would have created. Israel benefited from this outcome even though it meant absorbing Scud attacks without retaliating. Sometimes the hardest strategic decision is to not act, to show restraint when every instinct and every political pressure demands action. Shamir and the Israeli government made that difficult decision, and history suggests it was the right one. The Scud attacks on Israel during the Gulf War remain a fascinating case study in strategy, diplomacy, technology, and human psychology. They demonstrate how a militarily weak weapon can have strategic importance if it creates political complications. They show the complexity of coalition warfare and the difficulty of maintaining unity among allies with different interests. They illustrate the limits of both offensive air power and defensive missile systems. They reveal the resilience of civilian populations under attack, and they remind us that in war, as in all human endeavors, things rarely go exactly according to plan. Saddam Hussein tried to destroy the coalition against him by dragging Israel into the war. He failed, but it was a near-run thing, dependent on Israeli restraint, American diplomacy, and a good deal of luck that the casualties from the attacks were not higher. If even a few variables had been different, the outcome of the Gulf War could have been very different. That is the lesson of the Scud attacks. Small things can have large consequences. Seemingly minor threats can become strategic crises. And sometimes the most important battles are not the ones fought with tanks and aircraft, but the ones fought in diplomatic back channels and in the decisions of leaders under pressure.